Last Monday, my CEO let his daughter steal my cancer research in front of $75 million investors, then gaslit the entire room into believing I was unstable, emotional, and replaceable. By Wednesday, the company was bleeding money, investors were threatening fraud investigations, and federal attorneys were already requesting internal records tied to hidden calibration data nobody inside the company could reproduce. At 6:14 a.m. on Thursday, federal agents walked into Arden Biodynamics while executives were still trying to delete files. And by the end of the month, the same people who stole my work were facing criminal exposure, board removal, and possible prison time. My name is Lenora Vale, and this is the revenge story of how one biotech empire collapsed after they tried to erase the woman who actually built it. Chapter 1. The Day They Erased Me. I knew something was wrong the second Graham Holloway stopped taking notes. That man never stopped taking notes. For the past 40 minutes, he had been scribbling across a legal pad while I walked a room full of investors through 4 years of research at Arden Biodynamics. Every graph behind me represented another holiday spent inside a laboratory, another night sleeping on the office couch, another morning pretending coffee counted as breakfast. The boardroom overlooked downtown Boston through walls of glass that probably cost more than my first apartment. Everyone around that table looked polished and expensive, tailored suits, perfect watches, the kind of people who used words like acquisition over lunch. And then there was me. I still smelled faintly like ethanol from the lab downstairs. I had been up since 4 rerunning simulations because this presentation was supposed to change everything. If the investors approved the funding round, Arden Biodynamics would receive $75 million. Victor Arden had repeated that number so many times lately, it felt burned into my brain. 75 million. Enough to expand the clinical program, enough to build a second research division, enough to finally prove I was more than the quiet scientist nobody noticed until something stopped working. I clicked to the next slide. The room stayed silent while I explained the new stabilization sequence. Naomi Mercer leaned forward with genuine interest. Graham narrowed his eyes at the data. Even the younger analysts stopped typing. For one brief moment, I actually let myself believe this was finally my turn. Victor sat near the end of the table, watching me. 3 years earlier, he had found me asleep in the lab beside a centrifuge after a 19-hour shift. Instead of sending me home, he brought me stale vending machine coffee and told me I was the future of the company. Nobody had ever said something like that to me before. I grew up above a laundromat outside Providence. My mother worked double shifts her entire life and still apologized whenever the heat stopped working in winter. Men like Victor Arden did not usually see women like me. That was probably why his betrayal hurt more than the theft itself. I was reaching for the remote to switch slides when the boardroom doors opened. Celeste Arden walked in like she had been invited to save the room. Cream-colored suit, perfect hair, perfect smile. The kind of confidence people develop when life keeps rewarding them before they earn anything. She crossed the room slowly, not even glancing at me. "Sorry to interrupt everyone," she said. "My father asked me to share an updated strategic direction before we finalize discussions." Victor said nothing. That silence hit me harder than if he had slapped me. Celeste reached for the remote in my hand. For half a second, I almost held on to it. Then I looked around the room. Every investor was watching. I let go. My presentation vanished from the screen. The shift in energy was immediate. Chairs turned toward Celeste. People straightened in their seats. Graham set his pen down completely. I was still standing there beside the screen, but somehow I had already disappeared. Celeste opened her presentation. My stomach tightened. Every slide was built from my research: targeted activation, controlled degradation, precision sequencing, molecular stabilization. Then she reached the final section. My chest went cold. Those were not company files. Those were my private refinements, experimental calibration layers I had never uploaded into the corporate system. Suddenly, I remembered every late night I caught Celeste wandering through the lab, pretending she wanted to learn more about the science. She never asked questions like a scientist. She asked questions like someone memorizing lines before a performance. Graham leaned back slowly. "This feels much more scalable," he said. Naomi smiled at Celeste. "You clearly understand where this industry is heading." I almost laughed. 6 months ago, Victor had said nearly the exact same thing to me. Celeste stepped closer while investors studied the screen behind her. "People like you build things," she whispered quietly enough for only me to hear. "People like us know how to sell them." Then she smiled. "We don't need your ideas anymore." I wish I could say I argued. I did not. I just stood there while strangers discussed my work like I was no longer part of the room. Nobody asked where the data came from. Nobody asked why my presentation disappeared. Nobody asked whether I agreed with any of this. One investor even directed a technical question toward me. Celeste answered before I could open my mouth. And somehow, everyone accepted it. That was the moment I understood what invisibility really felt like. Not silence, replacement. Victor still wouldn't look at me. That hurt more than anything. He wasn't sacrificing an employee. He was sacrificing the person who built the platform his company depended on. I closed my laptop slowly. Nobody noticed. Investors were already talking about valuation increases and media positioning, while Celeste stood at the center of the room accepting compliments for work she barely understood. I removed my employee badge and placed it quietly on the table. This time, Victor finally looked at me. There was no guilt in his face anymore, only calculation. I walked out before my expression could crack. The elevator ride felt endless. By the time I reached the parking garage, my hands were shaking so badly I missed the car handle twice. I sat behind the steering wheel trying to breathe normally while my phone buzzed nonstop beside me. Ivy Bennett texted first. "What the hell just happened?" Then Victor, "We need to talk immediately." I ignored both. Instead, I opened my laptop. Encrypted folders filled the screen. Independent calibration logs, private timestamps, legal documentation, research protection records. Months ago, after catching Celeste standing beside my workstation close to 11 at night, I started building a separate research path outside the corporate system. She had smiled at me back then and said she just wanted to understand the process better. Real scientists don't study science through investor language and polished buzzwords. I copied the final archive onto an external drive. Outside my windshield, Arden Biodynamics still glowed above Boston like a monument to power. Inside that building, everyone probably believed Celeste Arden had just saved the company. I leaned back against the seat and finally smiled. They still thought they had stolen my work. They had no idea they had only stolen the part I wanted them to see. Chapter 2. They stole the credit, not the science. The next morning, Arden Biodynamics looked like a company trying to smile through internal bleeding. The lobby screens still played the same polished branding video about innovation and the future of medicine. Receptionists still greeted people with practiced smiles. Executives still walked through the building carrying expensive coffee and pretending everything was under control. But the second I stepped onto the research floor, I felt the panic. Nobody was moving normally. Technicians rushed between testing rooms carrying printouts and tablets. Someone cursed behind a closed lab door. 2 junior researchers stood near the protein analyzer whispering like they were discussing a death in the family. Then I heard Daniel Cross yelling before I even saw him. "That sequence is collapsing after activation," he snapped into his phone. "I do not care what Celeste promised the investors. The numbers are wrong." He turned the corner and stopped cold when he noticed me. The hallway went quiet almost instantly. That was the first thing betrayal teaches you. People stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a situation. I kept walking toward my workstation with the storage box tucked under my arm. I only planned to collect the rest of my personal things and leave before another disaster started. Too late. Ivy Bennett hurried toward me with dark circles under her eyes and a coffee stain across the front of her blouse. "Victor completely lost it this morning," she whispered. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and started stacking notebooks into the box. Ivy lowered her voice even more. Celeste has been forcing reruns since 6 a.m. Nobody can stabilize the activation layer. Daniel almost got fired an hour ago. As if on cue, Victor exploded somewhere deeper in the lab. I do not want excuses. I want results. A younger technician walked out of testing room 2, looking like she was trying not to cry. I slipped another notebook into the box. Science does not care about presentations, I said quietly. Ivy stared at me for another second. You knew this would happen. The truth sat heavy in my chest. I knew Celeste didn't understand the science. I just never thought Victor would burn the entire company trying to protect her. At the far end of the hallway, the executive elevator doors opened sharply. Victor Arden stepped out, looking like a man who hadn't slept all night. Everyone immediately stopped talking. Lenora, my office, now. The entire lab floor watched me follow him upstairs. Not one person defended me yesterday. Now suddenly everyone looked terrified I might leave. Funny how quickly people learn your value once things start breaking. Victor kept pacing behind his desk after we entered the office. His phone vibrated non-stop against the wood surface. Investor calls, board notifications, legal alerts. The empire was cracking faster than he expected. "Where is it?" he asked finally. I set the storage box down beside the chair. "Where is what?" His jaw tightened. "The final calibration layer, the sequencing pathway. We cannot reproduce the stabilization model." I sat slowly across from him. This man felt larger than life to me, the brilliant CEO who recognized my talent before anyone else did. Now all I saw was a scared executive trying to hold water in his hands. "You removed something," he said. "No. Then why is nothing working?" I watched his stare for another second. "Because Celeste stole the results, not the science." That finally silenced him. The room stayed completely still except for the buzzing phone on his desk. Investor, board member, legal department. Every part of the company was starting to fracture at once. Victor rubbed his forehead hard. "Lenora, listen to me carefully. We can still fix this." I almost laughed at that. "Can you fix what happened yesterday?" He didn't answer. Instead, he switched into negotiation mode so quickly it made my stomach turn. "We can restructure your compensation package, equity, executive oversight, any title you want." I looked around the office slowly. The biotech awards, the framed magazine covers, the polished shelves full of achievements built partly on my work. This room used to make me believe hard work mattered. "I gave this company 4 years of my life," I said quietly. Victor exhaled hard. "And if investors walk away, hundreds of employees lose theirs." That one hurt because it was partly true. Daniel, Ivy, half the research floor downstairs. Most of them had nothing to do with yesterday. Victor noticed my hesitation on my face immediately. "You owe this company." I looked at him directly. No, this company owed me honesty. I stood up before he could say another word. The moment I opened the office door, Celeste was standing outside. For the first time meeting her, she didn't look perfectly composed. She still wore the expensive suit, still carried herself like she belonged in front of cameras, but the cracks had started showing. "Tell me what is missing," she said immediately. I studied her face for a second. Understanding. Her eyes narrowed. "You are sabotaging us." "No," I replied calmly. "I just stopped protecting you." For a second, she looked genuinely shaken. Not guilty, scared. Because deep down, she finally understood the truth. She had no idea how to rebuild what she stole. Back downstairs, the collapse kept spreading. Daniel got blamed publicly during the afternoon lab review. One of the oncology researchers quit on the spot after Victor screamed at him in front of half the floor. Human resources started circling like paramedics around a crash site. And through all of it, people kept looking at me differently. Yesterday, I was invisible. Today, everyone suddenly remembered my name. By noon, investors were demanding another internal demonstration. Celeste tried handling the meeting herself. Big mistake. She stood in front of the conference screen talking about scalability and future expansion while avoiding every technical detail that mattered. Then Graham Holloway interrupted her. "What stabilization ratio are you using during activation sequencing?" Celeste froze, only for maybe 2 seconds, but powerful men don't build fortunes without learning how to spot panic. Janiel jumped in before she could answer. Too fast, too smooth. Graham leaned back slowly after that. He didn't say another word for the rest of the presentation, but I caught him watching both of them carefully, like he was finally realizing he invested in the wrong person. By evening, rumors were already moving through biotech circles across Cambridge. Arden Biodynamics failed internal replication after major investor presentation. That sentence spread faster than any press release ever could. Finally, I got home after 9, carrying the last box from my office. Newton jumped onto the couch beside me when I opened my laptop. Security footage filled the screen. October 12th, 10:42 p.m. Celeste standing beside my workstation after everyone else went home, reading notes she thought I would never notice missing. That was the night I stopped trusting anyone inside Arden Biodynamics. Independent timestamps, separate storage drives, private calibration pathways, quiet meetings with legal counsel. Not for revenge, for survival. My phone buzzed against the coffee table. Unknown number. I answered after the second ring. "Lenora," Graham Holloway said quietly, "I think your company still doesn't understand who actually built that platform." Then another notification appeared across my laptop screen. Investor emergency review meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning.
Chapter 3. They were selling something they didn't understand. I drove through downtown Boston before sunrise with the radio turned off and my phone face down in the passenger seat. Victor had called 11 times during the night. I never answered once. Rain blurred the windshield while traffic crawled through Cambridge, and for the first time since everything exploded inside that boardroom, I finally admitted something I had been avoiding. I was scared. Not of Celeste, not even of Victor. I was scared none of this would matter. That investors would protect the company, that lawyers would bury me, that 4 years of my life would disappear forever under somebody else's name, while everyone in biotech quietly pretended not to notice. By the time I parked outside the cafe Graham Holloway had chosen, my stomach felt tight enough to make me nauseous. The place sat 3 blocks from Arden Biodynamics, small and crowded and warm enough to fog the windows from inside. Graham was already waiting. His tie looked crooked, his eyes were bloodshot. A half-finished coffee sat untouched in front of him. For the first time since meeting him, he did not look like a billionaire investor. He looked like a man realizing he trusted the wrong people. He stood when I approached. "Thank you for coming." "You sounded serious." "I am serious." No fake executive charm, no small talk. That made me trust him slightly more. Rain tapped softly against the windows while I sat across from him. Finally, Graham leaned forward. "What exactly is happening inside Arden Biodynamics?" I wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Instead of answering immediately, I looked back at him. "What do you think is happening?" He leaned back slowly. "I think Victor Arden tried to sell investors something his daughter does not actually understand." That sentence changed everything, because up until that moment, I was still not sure whether anyone powerful had noticed what happened inside that boardroom. Now I knew at least one person had. Graham rubbed his jaw tiredly. "Celeste avoids every technical follow-up. Victor answers every difficult question for her. Yesterday's replication demo got delayed again this morning." He paused. "Now the board suddenly calls an emergency review meeting." I stayed quiet. He lowered his voice. "Tell me if I am wrong." My chest tightened, because this was the moment that actually mattered. Not the humiliation, not the anger. This. If Graham decided I sounded emotional instead of credible, I was finished. Companies survive scandals all the time. Scientists do not. I stared down at the coffee before answering. She stole enough to impress people who do not know what they are looking at. Graham went still. Outside, headlights smeared across the rain-soaked street, while the cafe buzzed softly around us. Inside my chest, panic kept pushing harder. I imagined the next 6 months too clearly. Victor filing injunctions, the board accusing me of intellectual property theft, industry executives avoiding the research floor while legal teams locked themselves inside conference rooms for hours. Victor kept calling. I ignored every voicemail. By evening, my apartment felt painfully quiet. No coworkers, no meetings, no lab noise. Just rain against the windows and a half-eaten dinner sitting untouched beside my laptop. Funny how invisible people suddenly become once they stop being useful. Then suddenly, everyone wants access to your mind the second money starts disappearing. Newton slept beside me while I opened the secure storage case near the desk. Inside sat the real prototype architecture, not the polished investor version, the complete system. For a moment, I just stared at it. 4 years of my life reduced to encrypted files and molecular sequencing models. If this failed, I would lose everything: my career, my reputation, possibly my future in biotech entirely. My phone rang again. Graham. I answered immediately. Lenora, the entire investment group wants to meet you tomorrow morning. Silence filled the apartment. Then he added quietly, if what you're saying is true, Arden Biodynamics may have committed investor fraud. After the call ended, I spent hours organizing every piece of evidence across my dining table: security footage, private timestamps, prototype sequencing logs, legal review documents, independent calibration records. The next morning, I walked into a private conference room downtown, carrying the prototype case with both hands. Every investor from Arden Biodynamics was already waiting. Nobody looked relaxed anymore. I placed the case down slowly in the center of the room. Then I looked at every face staring back at me. What you saw in that boardroom was not the breakthrough. The room went silent. I opened the case. This is Chapter 4: The Moment They Realized Who Built Everything. Every investor in that conference room stopped breathing for a second after I opened the case. Not because the prototype looked impressive, because it looked unfinished. Real science usually did. No glossy branding, no polished investor language, no dramatic animations hiding the ugly parts underneath. Just exposed architecture, sequencing layers, molecular timing systems, and 4 years of work reduced to raw data spread across a conference screen. For the first time since this nightmare started, nobody could hide behind presentation skills anymore. Now they had to look directly at the truth. I connected the prototype system to the display while silence settled heavily across the room. Graham Holloway stood near the windows with both arms crossed. Naomi Mercer leaned forward slowly, while the other investors exchanged uncertain looks. Good. That confusion meant they were finally seeing the difference between a pitch deck and actual science. I opened the calibration structure first. This is the full stabilization architecture. Nobody interrupted. I zoomed deeper into the sequencing layers and watched several investors straighten in their chairs almost immediately. Most of them did not fully understand what they were seeing, but they understood enough to realize this system was far more complicated than anything Celeste presented inside that boardroom. The version shown at Arden Biodynamics only included the output pathway, not the calibration logic underneath it. Naomi frowned. So the company never fully understood the process? I looked directly at her. They understood enough to sell it, not enough to build it. The room went dead silent again. That was the exact moment the power shifted, not emotionally, financially, because everyone in that room suddenly realized they almost invested $75 million into a company that could not replicate its own technology. One older investor removed his glasses slowly. "You mean the replication failures came from missing architecture?" "Critical architecture," I corrected. Graham rubbed one hand across his mouth. "Jesus Christ." I continued the demonstration without rushing. No executive performance, no buzzwords, just methodology, failure points, sequencing correction, stabilization timing. The deeper I walked them through the prototype, the more uncomfortable the room became, because now they understood something worse. Arden Biodynamics never possessed the complete system. They only possessed the parts I allowed inside company infrastructure. Naomi looked up sharply. They never had the full platform? No. Another silence settled across the room. One investor actually laughed quietly in disbelief. "We almost funded a fraud." Nobody disagreed. I pointed toward the live calibration structure moving across the screen. They thought they stole the breakthrough. What they stole was the preview. That landed hard. Shock spread across several faces immediately, not toward me, toward Victor Arden, toward Celeste, toward themselves, because powerful people hated realizing they had been manipulated. Graham stared at the sequencing models still moving across the display. "You built all this yourself?" "Mostly." He shook his head slowly. "No wonder they're panicking." For the first time since the presentation disaster, nobody in that room looked at me like an employee anymore. Now they looked at me like the person who actually mattered. And somehow that hurt more than the humiliation. Because suddenly, everyone respected the exact mind they ignored for 4 years. Funny how invisible women become until rich people start losing money. I activated the live simulation. The prototype processor hummed softly on the conference table while sequencing data stabilized across the screen in real time. Not perfect, not ready for FDA approval, but functional, reproducible, real. Naomi leaned closer. "So this actually works?" "Yes. And nobody at Arden Biodynamics can replicate it?" "Not without the missing calibration layers." The room shifted again. Now they were no longer looking at a workplace dispute. Now they were staring at a possible corporate disaster. I reached into the case and placed another stack of documents onto the table. Independent timestamps, encrypted archive records, private refinement logs, legal review paperwork. Then I placed printed security stills beside them. Celeste standing near my workstation after hours, reading documents she was never authorized to access. Naomi stared at the photos for several long seconds. "This is a governance nightmare." Across the table, another investor muttered quietly. This could become investor litigation. Meanwhile, inside Arden Biodynamics, the collapse was getting worse by the minute. My phone vibrated non-stop across the table. I finally glanced down after another message from Ivy appeared. "Board meeting is becoming a bloodbath." Another message followed seconds later. Victor just blamed Daniel in front of legal and HR. That part actually made me angry. Daniel spent months protecting the research team while Victor protected his daughter. Now, innocent people were being sacrificed to contain the damage. Another message appeared. Celeste tried explaining the sequencing pathway herself. A board member stopped her halfway. For a second, I imagined Celeste standing in that room, realizing nobody believed her anymore. No polished confidence, no investor smiles, no father stepping in fast enough to save her. Just silence, the same silence I stood inside while she erased me. Strangely, I still did not feel victorious. I thought revenge would feel warmer than this. Instead, it felt cold, heavy, exhausting. Because underneath all the anger, part of me still remembered Victor bringing me coffee in the lab at midnight while telling me I mattered. That memory was harder to kill than I expected. Naomi finally closed the document folder. If this becomes public, Arden Biodynamics could face serious investor litigation. Graham nodded grimly, and the board knows it. One investor near the end of the table looked directly at me. You should have been leading those meetings from the beginning. That sentence hit harder than I expected, not because it fixed anything, because nobody said it until powerful people became afraid. For years, I asked for recognition quietly, respect quietly, credit quietly. Nobody listened. Then investors started panicking, and suddenly the entire world wanted to hear me speak. Graham walked slowly toward the conference room windows overlooking downtown Boston. After several long seconds, he turned back toward the room. We are officially pausing all funding discussions with Arden Biodynamics pending legal review. Nobody objected, not one person. That was the moment Victor Arden officially lost the company. Then Graham looked back at me. We would like to continue discussions with Veil Therapeutics. One by one, the investors started standing from the table. Some shook my hand awkwardly. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Then Graham stepped forward and extended his hand. This should have been your room from the start. I shook his hand quietly. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated again. Emergency board vote initiated against Victor Arden. Then another notification appeared beneath it. Victor Arden calling. For a second, I just stared at the screen while the room disappeared around me.
Chapter 5. They lost everything trying to take what was mine. The call from Victor Arden kept flashing across my screen while the conference room slowly emptied around me. I never answered it. Outside the windows, downtown Boston disappeared beneath cold rain and gray clouds while investors gathered their files and avoided looking at one another for too long. Nobody liked sitting inside a room where $75 million almost turned into a disaster, especially not powerful people who believed they were too smart to be manipulated. Graham Holloway shook my hand one final time before leaving. "We'll contact your legal team tomorrow." I nodded quietly. The moment the doors closed behind the last investor, the silence finally hit me. Not victory, not satisfaction, exhaustion. 3 days later, Arden Biodynamics barely looked like the company that once dominated biotech headlines across Boston. Industry blogs published new leaks every few hours. Investors froze negotiations completely. Board investigations expanded daily. Executives started resigning before internal review teams could question them. News vans sat outside headquarters almost every morning now. One article showed Victor Arden leaving the building alone with 2 attorneys while reporters shouted questions behind him. Another showed employees carrying boxes through the lobby beneath the Arden Biodynamics logo that was already being removed from the wall. That image stayed with me longer than I expected, not because I hated him, because part of me still remembered the man who once sat beside me in a dark laboratory at midnight, telling me I belonged there.
The collapse spread faster than anyone expected. Not because I destroyed the company, because Victor built an empire around the wrong people and ignored the ones actually keeping it alive. Once investors realized the science never belonged to the executives presenting it, trust disappeared overnight. My phone barely stopped vibrating anymore. Recruiters, law firms, investors, medical journals. Everyone suddenly wanted access to the woman they ignored for 4 years. Funny how invisible people become until powerful men start losing money. Most of the calls went unanswered. For the first time in my career, I no longer wanted validation from the old system. I wanted ownership. Veil Therapeutics officially secured its first funding commitment that Friday afternoon, $55 million after preliminary due diligence review. Not instant success, not fantasy,
The investors still demanded compliance review, independent testing, outside validation, and months of verification before final release of funding. Honestly, that made me trust them more. Real science was supposed to survive scrutiny. I rented a small research space outside Kendall Square while equipment arrived piece by piece over the next week. Nothing looked impressive yet. Half the walls still needed wiring. Temporary folding cables served as workstations. Extension cords crossed the floor like vines. But for the first time in years, nobody interrupted me halfway through explaining my own work. Ivy Bennett joined the company 2 days later, carrying 3 boxes of lab notes and enough caffeine to restart a dead body. The second she walked through the door, she looked around the unfinished space and laughed. "This place looks terrible." I smiled, for the first time all week. It has potential. It also has functioning leadership, which already makes it better than Arden. A few former researchers reached out quietly over the next several days. Not because of salary, because scientists always knew who built the platform. They were just too afraid to say it while still Victor controlled the building. One evening, long after everyone else left, someone knocked softly against the half-open lab door. I looked up from the sequencing monitor. Celeste Arden stood outside. For a second, I barely recognized her. The polished executive image was gone. No expensive styling, no perfect confidence. She looked exhausted, smaller somehow. Her eyes moved slowly across the unfinished lab space before settling on me. "This is what destroyed us?" I leaned back in my chair. "No, you destroyed yourselves." She stayed quiet for several seconds before finally walking inside. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument. Celeste looked toward the equipment cases stacked against the wall. "My father won't even speak to me anymore." I did not know how to respond to that. Part of me wanted to feel satisfied. Instead, I mostly felt tired. She sat slowly across from me. For the first time since I met her, she stopped pretending to understand science. No executive language, no investor performance, just honesty. "How did you know this would happen?" I studied her face carefully before answering. "Because while you were studying my slides, I was studying you." Her expression cracked slightly. Not anger, recognition, because she finally understood the truth sitting in front of her the entire time. She spent years trying to steal authority without earning understanding first, and science punished shortcuts eventually. Everyone in biotech knew that. Celeste stared down at her hands. I thought if I sounded confident enough, people would believe me. They did, until they didn't. Neither of us spoke after that. Eventually, she stood and looked around the lab one final time. "I really thought you needed art and biodynamics to matter." I shook my head gently. "No, I just needed people to stop standing between me and my work." She nodded once before quietly walking back into the cold Boston night. The following afternoon, a courier arrived carrying a sealed package. Inside sat one of my old research notebooks from Arden Biodynamics. The leather cover looked worn from years inside my backpack. A handwritten note rested on top. "You won. Victor Arden." I stared at the words for a long time. Strangely, they didn't feel satisfying, because this story was never really about winning. Years ago, I genuinely believed Victor Arden cared about the science as much as I did. That was the hardest part of betrayal. The good memories survived longer than the anger. I closed the notebook carefully and placed it beside the prototype case. Then I walked back into the main lab where Ivy and the others were setting up equipment for the next testing phase. Music played softly from someone's speaker. Researchers argued over calibration numbers. Coffee cups covered half the tables already. For the first time in years, nobody minimized my slides. Nobody spoke over me in meetings. Nobody took credit for work they never understood. I did not need Victor Arden anymore. I did not need art and biodynamics. I did not need the title they once convinced me to chase. I only needed the truth to finally stand where everyone could see it. Maybe that was the real revenge after all. Not destroying the people who underestimated you, building something so undeniable they never get to define your worth again. Ivy looked up from across the lab. So what now? I glanced around the room before answering. Now we build something nobody can take from us. And if someone has ever stolen your work, your voice, or the credit you deserved, I really want to ask you something. What helped you stand back up after realizing the people you trusted never planned to see your value in the first place?